Hello Internet, 60x Self. Sorry this one is coming a little bit late, but it's going to be a longer one. Found another text adventure game that we could play. It's called My Father's Long, Long Legs. It's another one by Michael Lutz, the guy who did The Uncle Who Works for Nintendo, which I will put a link to right here on my beard. And it's another kind of weird, kind of creepy one, and it's going to be another one that's basically just me cold reading the whole game because it's a text adventure. I don't know if it has multiple parts. I don't know if it has multiple endings like The Uncle Who Works for Nintendo. So this may be a one-part, one-time thing, or it may be multi-parts. We're going to find out together. But either way, before we jump into our game, of course, our question of the day is, what is your favorite supervillain? I know, completely unrelated to the game at hand, but I couldn't think of a good question before we jump into this game that would tie in at all. My favorite supervillain for a long time was Mr. Sinister. He's an X-Men villain in the Marvel Universe. He was my favorite at a time when I was very, very, very into vampires. This is a long time ago. This is pre-Twilight, pre-True Blood, pre-Vampire Diaries, pre-all of that stuff. This is more around the time of like Interview with a Vampire and those kind of Anne Rice-y movies. But anyway, I was very into that. Mr. Sinister is this weird, very difficult to kill, vampire-like villain. I remember my first introduction to him was the X-Men cartoon, when he was trying to steal the genes from Jean Grey and Cyclops to make like a perfect being or something crazy like that. It was weird, but I was super into his aesthetic. Anyway, let's get started on this thing. My Father's Long, Long Legs by Michael Lutz. Parts of this game make use of sound effects. Play with headphones for the optimal experience. That goes for those of you watching this video as well. My family lived on the southern edge of a certain Midwestern industrial city in an old house, old enough that its basement still had a dirt floor. I was not yet old enough to openly question a parent's behavior, but certainly old enough to recognize its oddness when my father began digging. I retain only a single clear memory of the time before the situation became alarming and my father forsook sunlight forever. I am sitting at the bottom of the wooden stairs that led down to our basement. Ahead in the dimness stands my father, up to his waist in the hole. Still in his dark blue uniform from the factory, skin and fabric blackened by the hot breath of machinery and further smudged now by the damp earth, I watch father with the satisfaction of a child who sees in her parent a well of limitless capability. Upstairs, my mother called out that dinner is done. My father takes one last shovel of earth, turns it over the side of the excavation, and, in a single incredible motion, crawls out of the hole simply by pressing the sole of his boot to the lip of the pit and moving his whole body upward, walking right past me, right up the stairs. He was always a tall, angular man, as the remaining pictures of him suggest, and to this day I can clearly conjure the marvelous image of my father's long, long legs striding over me as he emerged from the hole he was to spend years digging beneath our house. Apart from him, there were three of us: my mother, my younger brother, and myself. There are many things about my mother I do not understand. She first found my father attractive, she admitted to me many years later, because of how unusual he was. He had come to the Midwestern industrial town and secured a job at the same factory where my mother was working. Though a practical man, he read constantly and voraciously in subjects ranging from engine repair to philosophy, a habit instilled in him he had claimed by his own parents. This was all my father ever said of his family beyond us. Any further inquiry into the subject caused him to leave the room or bring up some other pressing issue. Mother once theorized that father had run away from home. Whatever reasons for leaving his family behind, my father did not wait too long before beginning a new one. I was born only a few months after my parents were married. Within a few years, father made enough money that my mother could stay home and watch over me and, not too long after, my brother. Then one night, when my brother was perhaps only a year old, father came home, pulled a brand new shovel from the back of his pickup truck, and descended into the basement, where he began to dig. At first, he told my mother that he was preparing to put down a cement floor, suggesting a prelude to a full or partial renovation of the house. As a child, the movements of adults were still largely mysterious to me, and I do not know the specific circumstances under which mother realized this motive was untrue. Nor do I know exactly what transpired when father told mother that they must go to the basement to discuss the matter closer to its source, for after the door shut behind them, my brother and I were left alone in the house. My brother cried most of the night, while I lay in my own bed, pillows pressed to my ears. The next day my mother reappeared, quietly prepared our meals, and then locked herself in her bedroom shortly before father returned home and commenced digging once again. My father, for his part, stopped sleeping in the bedroom with her, instead taking to the basement, a decision which coincided with the first signs of his terrible metamorphosis. The changes were slow, but noticeable. Father began to grow paler, and by the time the factory closed and he could spend the whole day in the basement, he was as white as chalk. Perhaps it was this general evidence of wear, the change in skin tone and his subsequent emaciation, that made him look taller, as if his height increased in proportion to the depth of his project in the basement. Meanwhile, my mother put my brother into preschool and sent me to a latchkey program while she worked to support us. In what seemed a deliberate contrast to my father, she grew somehow darker and smaller. My father dug uninterrupted in the basement for at least a decade, and once I started high school, he did not even leave the basement to join us for dinner. Then my mother left him. Father was sufficiently enveloped in his life's task that there was no need to replay the arguments from my childhood. Whatever desire he once had to keep us home with him had apparently fallen away, lost in the depths of that pit. On her own, mother seemed to physically decompress, to become less bowed. She spoke more, laughed more, she had friends and lovers. We did not see my father at all after we left. On the day we left for good, he did not even come out of the basement, though by that point it was questionable how easily he could get through the doorway, so tall he had grown. It was not until many years later that my brother suggested we pay a return visit to our father's house. Needless to say, my brother and I had different experiences of our early home life. A year or so before we left, my father was the last time I ventured down into the basement. My brother was out with friends, having reached the age when he finally realized the awkwardness that resulted from bringing visitors to our home, and mother had locked the door to her room and apparently gone to bed. Father was, of course, laboring in the basement, and I was doing homework in the living room while watching television. There came a knock at the door. The man on the porch was squat, but dressed neatly in a suit, coat, and hat. A pair of very small spectacles was perched on the end of his nose, looking minuscule in comparison to his large round face. "Hello, young lady," he said to me in a labored voice. "Is your father home?" "Who are you?" I asked. The man tipped his old-fashioned hat back on his head, smiling with rubbery lips. "You would have no reason to know me, of course," he said, "but I'm your uncle." I left the man on the porch, the door locked, while I went to seek my mother's help. Thus I discovered she was unresponsive, as she often was in those days. This left me with only the option to summon my father from the basement. He did not respond when I opened the door and yelled down, though I thought I could hear faintly the sound of his digging. I looked back to the front door, where I could see through pebbled glass the rotund figure of the man who claimed to be my uncle, and descended the wooden stairs into the basement. The only light, as always, came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. My father had learned to operate in these conditions, but for me the lack of illumination cast the labyrinth below into a mess of confusing and seemingly contradictory paths of damp black earth and only slightly blacker shadow. Father had first attempted to dig straight down, but as the years went on, he elaborated his original plans, angling outward from the center of the basement at a depth of perhaps 15 feet. From there, he had begun to hollow out the entirety of the basement with one long, looping path, threaded and bent around itself like some monstrous length of viscera, all the while continuing his march downward. I stood on the bottommost stair that, as I thought of it, still properly belonged to our house. By my feet was a stack of unfamiliar books. They were old, with blank but warped brown covers. Next to them was what appeared to be an antique child's rattle, caked with dirt and several rocks chipped into various unnatural but vaguely instrumental shapes. I turned to the void and called for my father. No response came, but I grew more certain that I could hear, however distantly, the sound of father's shovel. I called for him again, this time giving also my purpose for interrupting his work. "There's a man at the door," I said. "He says he's my uncle." I stood and waited, and as I did so, the sound of digging stopped. My father emerged a minute or so later, unfolding himself from the narrow bends of his maze, his pale skin covered only by the rags of his clothing and everywhere dusted gray with soil, including, I noted, the corners of his mouth, which seemed stained particularly thoroughly and much more darkly. "Your uncle," father rumbled, not quite asking a question. He then added, "My brother." I nodded. "Show him in," he ordered. The squat stranger, my uncle, who I remember smelled of sour milk, seemed elated at his prospects. I led him down the basement stairs, his agitation growing exponentially until he saw my father standing at his full height. It must have been at least 8 or 9 feet then, I think, at the entrance of his renovations. I knew to take my leave, and as I ascended the stairs, I heard the visitor remark that my father seemed to have done very well for himself, all things considered. I never again saw the man who claimed to be my uncle, either that day or any day after. Perhaps not coincidentally, this is also my last clear memory of my father, and the one that returned to me many years later when my brother suggested we return to our father's house. My brother had always been a bit more sentimental regarding the matter. My brother was young enough when my father began digging that it seemed to him an indifferent fact of life. It seemed obvious to me that something was wrong with our home. Its wrongness was screamed, I thought, by the chilly terseness with which our mother moved through it, returning home from work in the late afternoon, serving meals, and retiring to her bedroom. The wrongness was screamed, of course, by my father, who, after losing his job at the factory, spent nearly all day in the basement, emerging at irregular intervals to eat and use the toilet. This is to say nothing of the physical changes he underwent as time went on. The wrongness was screamed by my own actions, the heavy worry I felt that at any moment the fragile equilibrium of our home would be upset and my brother's friends would witness the terrifying truth of our family situation. A situation I myself could not begin to articulate, but which I felt ashamedly that an outsider would. Of course, my brother, young as he was, saw nothing wrong with inviting his friends to our home, and even taking them down to the basement to see what he called, after our father's example, I believe, the renovations. The friends never asked to return to the basement after my brother took them down there. Some of them quietly deigned to never return to our house at all, much to my relief, though my brother was often disappointed. I recall only one instance, when my brother was perhaps 7, when one of his playmates made a scene. I believe my brother's friend came from a religious family, which may have been part of the problem, but that may also be something I recognize only due to my own biases. At any rate,
Though his cosmology was different from my own, he at least shared some of my anxieties when he attempted to explain to my brother that our father's project in the basement was deeply unnatural. I emerged from the living room because, down the hall, I could hear crying. I knew that my brother had a friend over, and so was prepared for the worst. The two boys stood outside the door to the basement, which still stood open. My brother looked up as I approached, at a loss as to how to comfort his weeping companion. "You're going to hell," our visitor informed me after I managed to get him to look at me. "That's where he's digging to down there," the child said, looking from me to my brother. "He's digging to hell, and you're all going with him."